Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, the What, Why and How of Cybersecurity for OT and IT, part 1 of the first cybersecurity webinar series. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. First, a quick intro about the webinar host. The National Operations Center of Excellence, NOCO, is designed to offer resources for transportation systems management and operations community. We support the people who operate the nation's transportation management systems by connecting them with the best practices and experts to save lives, time, and money. Feel free to browse the entire collection of NOCO resources along with other useful links to connect with us here in the useful links pod in the right side of your screen. A recorded version of this webinar along with the presentation slides will be available within 24 to 48 hours at the on-demand learning section of our website. So we're going to take questions at the very end of the webinar. We have a question pod here that you can interview questions during the webinar, and at the end we will go through those questions and read them out loud and pass it around to different presenters here to answer those questions. Here I wanted to quickly go over the framework of this webinar series with help from our speakers today, Rick, Tina, and Tom Bergen. Tom will go through the first part, Rick through the second part, and I'll cover the quick, brief intro about the third part. Tom?
Thank you, Nilu. Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So it's a three-part series. Today we're really going to go over kind of the basics, the why you need to concern yourself with cybersecurity, kind of the risk and impact to my agency, create clarity around what cybersecurity is not, and the kind of current resources that are out there today, and then also provide kind of a process of how to create a cybersecurity program within your organization. So today is kind of the first step in kind of raising the general awareness, and then it'll be followed by the second series, which is 2 weeks out, and I believe Rick will give you a little summary of that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. The focus of the second session on February 22nd will be on really digging into, the differences in the OT environment versus the IT environment, and why you need to have different approaches to security to both in order to really protect your entire organization. Attempts come in, top down, in through the OT to attack the OT, into the IT to attack the OT, but also bottom up in through your field equipment to come up into your network, and both are very serious, and so we'll be covering some ways of addressing those OT components that often are currently generally are very unprotected, and they really need to be before, especially today's environment is bad enough, but adding connected and autonomous vehicles to it will be very, very risky if we can't get the existing infrastructure secured. So we'll be talking about that mostly in the second one. And then Nilu, I believe, will brief on the third.
Yes, thanks, Rick. The third and final part of the webinar will be on cooperative efforts that are happening around cybersecurity. This webinar will be held on the second half of March, and the dates will be announced soon to you. So that was all for the intro part of this webinar. With that, we can start the webinar and hand things over to Tom.
Thanks, Nilu. Again, my name is Tom Bergen with Skyline. I'm going to kind of run through the introductions here of who we have online. My background is I've been working in the ITS world for the last 8-9 years, working with various states, federal side, and local transportation agencies to really work on network solutions that involve video sharing, mobile platforms, platforms as a service, fiber network design, and maintenance. All of these efforts have involved kind of traditional security, but have also, been impacting cybersecurity issues in a lot of the states we have to be cybersecurity compliant. So this becomes something that becomes part of a lot of our projects. Laura Gomez-Martin is an attorney with a specialty in cybersecurity and technology law and focuses on large-scale cybersecurity initiatives. Over the past several years, she's served as a lead policy advisor for the Maryland Department of Information Technology Enterprise Initiative, which is basically the state network, which also then connects to all of the agencies within the state. So it's a network of networks, so to speak, and those policies transcend down to those other agencies. She's also working on trying to establish a repeatable process for development of cybersecurity programs in the rest of the state, and there are county governments that may want to take advantage of what the state has already put in place today. She holds a Master in Security and Intelligence Cybersecurity Policy and is a Juris Doctorate degree focused on intellectual property and technology law. Chip Stuart is a cybersecurity compliant, or excuse me, a principal consultant, and over the last 20 years, he's been spending time implementing, architecting, and securing a wide array of communication networks. He has most recently been working on standing up the Security Operations Center for the state of Maryland, trying to help improve the posture of the state's network systems to the rollout of the Cybersecurity Program. He's really focused on the creation of a state enterprise architecture. Currently, he is also working on developing a scalable model of deploying cybersecurity programs to state and county governments and DOTs outside of Maryland. He maintains a JNCIE in service provider routing and switching, and a JNCIE in enterprise routing and switching. Rick Tenney with Mission Secure, the VP of Government and Critical Infrastructure. Mission Secure provides state-of-the-art kind of control systems for cybersecurity visibility at the edge, as the OT network, as he talked about. As Vice President, he works with all departments within MSI to help maintain and remain a premier cybersecurity suite of products for the industry. Prior to coming to MSI, Rick was with Alteris, one of the most trusted in-building alert systems for campuses, bases, government facilities, and corporate sector. And it was also with Rome Security, which developed the first emergency communication platform to successfully include large-scale, high-speed text messaging to cell phones and other wireless devices. And that system is currently in place in the National Capital Region, so it's multi-state, multi-agency, all three levels of government in place today. Rick is also on the board of the Partnership of Public Warning, which is focused on the development of a coherent national strategy for warning. So going back into the next slide, get over here and click, sorry. So today we're going to talk about the why, what, and the how. When we talk about this is why as transportation agencies should we be concerned about cybersecurity, making sure we're all on the same page there, and then go into the what is available and what is cybersecurity, and then we'll go into the how to create. So that's going to be our day. We're going to break it up. Chip Stewart's going to take over and go into the why, and then after that, Laura Gomez-Martin will go into the next two sections. Chip?
Thanks, Tom. So what you're seeing here is a high-level depiction of the distinct segments of the transportation network. This is the framework we're going to use throughout, the first part of the presentation to go over that. Everybody's network is unique, so we understand that this is not, what everybody has. And the idea here is just to build the, set up the building blocks in a way where everybody is talking about the same picture. So we're going to talk a little bit about the roadside devices, all of the things that exist out there, and the risks associated with them. We're also going to talk about the field network, which is the connectivity back and forth between the DOT Traffic Operations Center and the assets in the field. Now you might notice that the internet exists twice on here. It exists in the one spot as kind of the bridge between the ITS assets in the field and the TOC, and then it also exists as an external network. We're going to talk about the trusted network. This is where the crown jewels are. It's where your ATMS applications, your ITS, CNC, and other sensitive data lives. And then we're also going to talk about the external networks and the risks that they pose and all the things that connect in and out of your TOC and transportation networks. So before we get too far into the details, I do want to set a little bit of context and build some shared definitions with everybody. And then we'll move on to the fun stuff. So, when I think about cybersecurity, these are the kind of terms and definitions that I use, and I wanted to share those with everybody. For a lot of you guys, this is going to be a review, and I just want to make sure that, when I use a term, you guys understand what I'm trying to convey. So the first thing I want to cover is what is risk. So at a high level, risk is the exposure that exists at the intersection of threats, vulnerability, and assets. In other words, it's the probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. Assets are things, people, systems, and information. Threats are actions, or potentially inactions, that can cause damage to or loss of an asset. And vulnerability is the gap in our efforts to protect our assets. The other component I wanted to cover was the 3 areas of risk, commonly known as the CIA triad. So the C is confidentiality. It's preventing unauthorized disclosure of information. I is integrity. It's ensuring that the data isn't modified without authorization. And A is availability, ensuring that the information is available when you need it. As we look at each segment of the network, we'll highlight the risks a little bit through some real-life examples and stories of ways that there's been issues with these things. So for roadside devices, I think these 2 pictures illustrate some of the risks rather succinctly. There's 2 types of devices, portable and fixed. So in the past few years, there have been some relatively successful attacks carried out to change mobile DMS and VMS signs, from construction warnings to messages about zombies ahead or British coming. And it's kind of indicative of a couple different failures. The first failure being the physical security of these devices and the ease at which access can be gained, and the technical security. So a lot of these systems had default usernames and passwords to program them, and even when they didn't, with that physical access, resetting the device to factory defaults and configuring it was trivial. So there wasn't anything really preventing this from being dangerous other than the folks that were doing this weren't intending to cause harm. And it could very easily have been that. So roadside cabinets are also vulnerable. That's the picture on the right there that you're seeing. There are hundreds of thousands of these cabinets out there. This is where all the other sensors come in. There's nothing preventing somebody from attacking the integrity of this data. They could change weather information. They could make a road that is potentially icy seem like it's warm enough. And with these things, physical security is key. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about the why, at least I will. And the what and the how are also just as important to be thinking about. Installation of tamper sensors or door alarms are a great detective control that you can apply to monitor these assets. These cabinets are normally protected by the default key, which is on the keyring of so many people, every contractor, employees, folks that have left, and they connect back to the TOC network, which presents a risk because anybody that plugs in can just connect and potentially be back on your TOC network with nothing more than the number 2 key that's out there. This gets into the next risk we'll talk about, which is the field network. So field networks are one of the spots where there's a lot of divergence. Everybody's field network is completely different. There's a lot of risks associated with those. When you're using a public network, there's a big risk with availability. You have DDoS attacks and targeted attacks on anything that uses a public internet connection that presents a risk. There's also risk to integrity. A few years ago, there was a researcher that was able, through Shodan, which is a service that scans the internet, to find a bunch of traffic control signals and then set them to test mode, all because they were unprotected. There was no boundary protection. These devices didn't have strong credentials. I think they may have even had default credentials. There's also a risk to confidentiality. There is some sensitive data that goes across these links. You have LPR data, toll collection data, video from sensitive areas, credit card and payment information, and the list really goes on. A lot of the times these networks bypass firewalls. They're connected straight into the inside of a trusted network. When you bypass that protection, there's no threat protection against that. There's no data loss prevention. There's no intrusion detection. No protection for any threats. This is a huge vulnerability you have to be thinking about, because without the awareness that that provides, there's exposure. And most point-to-point wireless links and cellular APNs, which is a private cellular network, are extraordinarily vulnerable. So back in 2015, a group of researchers was able to take remote control of a Jeep Cherokee. They were able to do this because they used the information garnered from the radio system of a different Jeep to connect to the APN, cellular APN of the Jeep Cherokee network. From that, they were able to get into the target Jeep, log in through the radio, pivot to the 850 controller, which was the interface between the radio and the CAN bus and the rest of the vehicle, and then actually control the vehicle by reflashing that 850 controller. So, there's all sorts of risks that seem like they're not a big deal, but that the ability to pivot creates tremendous vulnerability. The bottom line with this is, when you have an insecure part of your network, the whole thing has risk. The chain's only as strong as the weakest link. So, the biggest part of the exposure is, why do you care? There's a lot of pieces, and the trusted network is where those crown jewels sit. It's the epicenter of all your operations. There's a lot of unique challenges here because the operators are the power users. They have the requirement to access all sorts of different resources like the advanced traffic management system, the corridor management, signal control, incident response workstations, and the internet. Right? These systems are all geared towards getting content to the power users. And in doing so, creates an additional risk because these stations can act as a conduit or a pivot point to get to resources that the bad guys can't get to directly. A great story about this is Thanksgiving 2016, the San Francisco BART system was compromised. They had to provide free train service for a little over 2 days. And what happened was that ransomware was sent to a workstation. It was opened. The nature of the ransomware allowed it to spread across the network because there was no boundary protection between these stations. And it moved from the management station to the ticketing booth and ultimately to the ticketing system and shut down the ticketing system. And this is why that secure network engineering and strong boundary protection is so important. So, these trusted networks have so many connections. This is where the value is delivered, and it also needs to be protected. So, and this gets into the trusted partners we deal with. So, the trusted partners, external networks, this is where the information winds up going, and you also pull some information in. So you have things like information streams from county DOTs if you're a state DOT, or state DOTs if you're a county DOT, your federal partners, Waze data, INRIX, et cetera. And there's a lot of connectivity that's unrelated to the organizational mission, like services vendors, IT hardware vendors, and IT managed service providers. And these connections have constantly been used as a conduit of attack. We'll cover the story of one of those in a little bit. There's also some risk if these connections aren't handled properly. We all know not to trust those external networks, and a lot of times it's way easier to set something up temporary and forget about it. And that, is part of the next story we'll get into as well. So, boundary protection is extraordinarily important in handling these external connections. But, in my opinion, the overarching biggest risk of all is the insider threats, also known as, the humans. This encompasses all those different segments of the DOT networks. So, the cybersecurity, concept is often associated with the implementation of new technologies and tools and all sorts of really nifty stuff to limit exposure. But without, no matter how much technology and security configuration you put in place, the people are often the weakest link and the biggest exposure that an organization faces. So, I mentioned earlier an example of an accidental insider threat. So an insider threat is generally one of three categories: accidental, negligent, and malicious. An example of an accidental insider threat is the individual who clicked on the ransomware in the San Francisco BART. There wasn't negligence, it wasn't a malicious intent, they just did the wrong thing. An example of negligence is a story I like. This is something that came to light after the false missile alert in Hawaii a few weeks ago. So the AP took a picture back in July around this, and this picture surfaced after the false alert. But somebody happened to notice that there was a Post-it note on the monitor, and it was an AP photo, so they were able to go grab the source. It was a high-quality image, and they zoomed in and found that, the HEMA operations officer was posing next to his password. And, that's an example of a negligent threat. It's a cliche to have a Post-it note with your password on your monitor or under your keyboard. And that's kind of an example of a negligent threat. The third type is the malicious threat. WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning is a great example of that. So Manning downloaded 400,000 classified documents and released them to WikiLeaks. It's textbook malicious insider threat. So an employee action can lead to the spread of malware. There can be an intentional mistake or a malicious mistake. And having those policies and the user awareness training is key to preventing that. So, I mentioned I was going to tell the story in a little bit, and this is a story many of you have probably heard. Back in 2013, Target had 11 gigs of data stolen with sensitive records for about 70 million users. So it's a good story to tell in this case because it's well documented, well known, and there's a lot of parallels between Target and DOT networks in this case. So this could just as easily have been a story about a DOT network being breached or a cyber terrorism event related to that. So for me, I think the top 5 takeaways that I see strongly overlapping with the DOT networks that I'd like to share, and I hope you guys think about connecting these points back to your unique challenges. So maintenance monitoring analysis of audit logs. So Target had some of the highest end tools available, and they just weren't using them. So without looking at that information, there's tremendous risk. So boundary defense is the next thing. So Target had left the portal for the vendor unsecured and wide open to the internet. And that, I think, is the single biggest cause of this breach. A single change would have prevented this from being a topic for this slide. Secure network engineering. Once the attackers made it in to Target's network, they had free reign to bounce around and connect to anything because there was nothing preventing transmission between these different security boundaries. Continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation. So these weren't zero-day attacks. These weren't things that were, impossible or just amazing feats to pull off. Vulnerability scanning, checking for commonly used passwords, running against baselines would have also prevented a lot of this attack from having the impact it did. And then penetration test and red team exercises. So a red team is a group of good guys that acts like the bad guys and tries to break into your network. A red team would have caught the vast majority of these problems. For example, the default user accounts. And I like to think about it, how many tools do you guys have that aren't being monitored properly, that aren't being used to their fullest extent? How many places do you have a default password where you just didn't disable it or don't even know about it? So a story I like to tell around that is that a DOT network was breached last year by a red team. They were able to gain entry to the network via Roadside Cabinet, and then were able to use a default password to gain access to the ATMS application. So, this is just another indication of the threats and the problems that are faced every day.
So Chip, thanks for those details. And one of the things I would ask, from a non-technical person is, what do you see as the key takeaways about these really unique DOT networks that have just spidered out connections all over their state or all over their region? What do you think is the key takeaways for most people online?
I believe that the DOTs are part of the critical infrastructure of the country. And the critical infrastructure has been identified as a target for cyber warfare, hackers, and cyber terrorism. I believe we need to be putting significant energy into protecting these assets and resources.
All right, great. Well, now we're going to transition over to Laura. She was getting a little sleepy during the technical conversation.
No, I'm awake. I'm good.
So, again, Laura Gomez-Martin is our lead policy advisor and has been working with the state for the last couple of years. So she's going to go into the what.
Yeah. So the what that I'm going to cover has two main aspects to it. First, I'm going to cover what is and is not considered cybersecurity, and then I'm going to go into what resources are out there and available for you all to actually create, establish, or further develop any cybersecurity program that you may already have. So in an effort to steer clear of just traditional boring definitions of cybersecurity that you can find in a dictionary, I'm going to just cover the four main aspects of what I see are the primary principles that make up cybersecurity. So the first is establishing policy and enforcing policy. So policy is often thought about with personnel, but it can be with your networks and assets. So a couple examples are acceptable use, account management, and configuration management. The next big aspect of cybersecurity is detailing the controls and configurations of your systems. So this can be for your assets, your systems, and your networks. It includes things like defining gold images and baseline configurations for laptops and desktops so that you have standard implementations of those. It can include requirements for network segmentation, access control limitations to sensitive data that you house. And then the third aspect is continuous monitoring. This includes setting up a security operations center, whether it's in-house or managed by a third party. It also includes setting up monitoring tools and configuring those to actually receive relevant alerts when you need them. And it also includes incident response, which is establishing a ticketing system for analysts to use on those alerts and actually audit them. And it also includes the establishment of standard operating procedures so those analysts know what to do in standard incidents. So now that we've covered what cybersecurity is, let's cover some common misconceptions of what cybersecurity is not. So cybersecurity is not a total elimination of risk. It's actually more about risk mitigation. So it's impossible to lock down your systems and your networks so much that you eliminate all risk. Unfortunately, if you do that, you can't provide services, you can't get services from others that you need that from because it's just too secure. So really the goal of cybersecurity is not to eliminate risk, but it's really to lower the risk to an acceptable level. Cybersecurity is also not a one-tool solution. So it's usually a combination of multiple solution sets. So while it's a combination of technology, personnel, and the governance policies all together. It's really an important takeaway from this is when you're looking at tool sets to implement cybersecurity controls, please make sure that as much as possible, while the tools are specific to elements, they do need to integrate with each other to provide a comprehensive coverage. So that's one important takeaway from that. Cybersecurity is also not a traditional IT function. So while it touches IT assets, yes, IT is more concerned with the performance and connection of computer systems and networks, while cybersecurity focuses more on those assets and connections and how to make them more secure while implementing security controls. So next we'll cover what some of the resources are that are available to you. So I won't cover these in a whole lot of depth. They're oftentimes hundreds and hundreds of pages long. So I'll just give a main oversight of the 3 main informative resources you can use. There's actually a number of other informative resources, but I've narrowed it down to these main 3. So these informative resources, what they do is they really give you a way to organize topics. They've been around for quite a while. And a lot of organizations use one of these 3 main ones. So most of these informative resources actually map to each other. When you read documentation on them, you'll see that a lot of them actually have the same central requirements to them. The exception to this comes when you have industry-specific requirements. So this might be if you're an entity covered by HIPAA because you handle protected healthcare information, or you handle payment card information, in which case the standard that you'd use is the PCI DSS for payment card information, payment card industry standards. But I'll run through the main gist of the 3 of these. So the first is the CIS Top 20, which gives a small number of actionable steps so that you can see immediate results. Organizations tend to steer towards the CIS Top 20 because it does have 20 baseline categories to start from. Now, there are multiple controls within each of those 20, so it's not just 20 simple steps. It is a complicated process. But it's more convenient than other standards such as NIST, which I'll get to in a moment, which has potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of requirements and controls to implement. So that makes the CIS Top 20 very convenient to most organizations. Next is the ISO 27001, which is created by the International Standards Organization. This is an international standard. Organizations usually choose this one because you can get accredited, and that's a testament to how secure your cybersecurity program is. A lot of organizations choose to do this one because with that accreditation, it's actually necessary for some government contracts and some contracts with subcontractors as well. And because it is an international standard, you can take it overseas, so it's very convenient. The next one is the NIST Special Publication 853. This is actually a federal government requirement. So this is a catalog of security and privacy controls. Federal government agencies actually must abide by this NIST standard. However, private industry and other government groups, such as state and local governments, can use this as a best practice and a baseline for their own cybersecurity programs. So, for instance, the Maryland Department of Information Technology has used NIST as their baseline standard. Aside from these informative resources, the federal government has been working on the past couple years to create a framework for increasing cybersecurity within critical infrastructure. So these developments have been just fairly recent, within the last 5 years or so. So in 2013, there was an executive order issued to improve security within infrastructure. And that was followed in 2014 by the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act, which is provided for a public-private partnership to improve cybersecurity, as well as research into cybersecurity and development of cybersecurity. Because of that Cybersecurity Enhancement Act, NIST actually came out with something in 2014 called the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. So this is actually still in draft form, and you can see from the diagram that in 2017 they actually put out a second modified version of it, version 1.1. So it's still a living document. It's still in draft form, and it's currently accepting comments on the NIST website. If you don't have anything else to do this weekend and want to find yourself reading through potentially hundreds of pages, you can feel free to add some comments to there. So the federal framework is very general in nature, but it does map to the central requirements of ISO, CIS, and NIST. So I want to show that on the next slide. So this is one of the, it has 4 columns to it. If you look on the first column, the function is identity. The first, second, and third column there, function, category, and subcategory, are actually directly pulled out from that proposed framework for improving critical infrastructure. So this is directly from the NIST document. The good thing about this is because that framework is so general, the federal government has actually mapped it to some of those informative references and informative resources. So you can see on the fourth column over, it actually does list the section of NIST, the section of ISO that this relates to. So it is very convenient. The main thing that an organization should do when starting a cybersecurity program is know that they're all going to be different. The framework you use is really going to depend on the organization itself and the applicable laws that you have to abide by if you have certain proprietary data or sensitive data that's already under the purview of HIPAA or PCI. So every program is going to be different. Every approach is going to be different. But the main thing you should start with is the major groupings. So in our practice, what I like to start with is usually the category, which is that second column there. A lot of these standards and frameworks have about 20 to 25 categories, and that really gives you the best grouping to make the project itself more manageable for you. So this is, I wanted to provide a concrete example of that category methodology. So this is a screenshot of the governance structure that was developed within the Maryland Department of Information Technology. So as you can see, looking through this mapping, there's 29 policies which cover the major topics within that organization, including across the top the Cybersecurity Program policy, which sets in management sign-off and a commitment to that cybersecurity initiative. So organizations can do it either way. There's some organizations that choose to have one central policy that covers 20 to 30 topics or more, whereas you can do it how the Department of Information Technology did it within Maryland, which is they split up each of those topics into their own individual policies that you can download. And as you can see from looking through the topics, cybersecurity policies really touch every aspect of an organization. It touches on personnel through acceptable use and account management. It touches on technology through asset management and configuration management, network documentation, and then it also sets the baseline guidelines for how to actually start some of the process level documentation. So it talks about how vendors should be assessed, how third-party interconnections to the network should be approved. So, you know, this and the standards that I just went through, it does seem like it's a daunting undertaking for an organization of any size, but there are ways that you can make the development of it more manageable, and there are resources to help you along the way, not only the standards themselves, but organizations that are willing to help with the process.
All right, great. So that's kind of the what, Laura, and I have a question. You know, it sounds like there's, you know, Chip talked about the risks that are out there and you know, being part of critical infrastructure. And then you talked about the, you know, kind of the definitions and some of the framework resources that are out there. But it doesn't sound like there is like a one-size-fits-all model.
Right.
That, because every DOT operates a little differently. So there isn't this one standard, hey, you do it this way everywhere. Is that kind of true, and why is that the case, if that's true?
Yeah. So cybersecurity isn't because it's not a total elimination of risk. It's managing what risk you're willing to tolerate. Every organization is going to have a different requirement for what they're willing to adhere to and risk. So some organizations might say we offer such critical services that we can't afford any downtime or have our systems be unavailable for more than 5 minutes, let's say. While other aspects of a network might have more risk, might be vulnerable to more risk. But at the same time, even though they're more vulnerable, they don't offer those critical services. So they might be willing to say, we can tolerate some downtime. So it's all about what you are willing to tolerate and how much risk you're willing to incur.
Okay. So it sounds like your risk versus operations equation and what you're trying to do kind of factors into that.
Right. It's very need specific, so the organization just really has to weigh what they need on the front end and then mold those cybersecurity controls to those needs.
Awesome. So we're going to move on to the most important part is how do we go about creating a cybersecurity program?
Right. So the how section, actually, I'm glad you asked that question just now, because the one thing I really wanted to emphasize in this process and covering these next few slides is there's no one single way to build a successful cybersecurity program. It's really dependent upon the organization itself. But the best way that we've found, the best methodology to tackle the program is in a phased approach. So that's how I wanted to cover this with you all. So the first phase is strategy and compliance, followed by implementation and security operations. All those phases have multiple steps within them, and then those steps also have sub-steps to them that we'll cover. But the most important thing I wanted to emphasize on this slide is you can see the gray arrows go all around the slide itself, and the phases here really feed into each other. So a successful cybersecurity program kind of creates this self-perpetuating program that's just constantly in need of tweaking, in need of improvement, and to keep it up to date with the latest technology and requirements. So the first part, strategy and compliance, is what we'll cover next. So the first step within strategy and compliance is research. So within this research, what you'll do is you'll identify your data and systems. So you'll actually take account of what sensitive information you have and do not have. This is sensitive information you either create or process or store on your systems. You should then research and choose a standard. The reason why you identify the data and systems first is because if you do have some of that protected healthcare information, for instance, that basically chooses your standard for you. You'd have to do HIPAA. But like I said, if you don't follow, or if you don't fall under one of those industry standards, you can really choose between NIST, CIS Top 20, ISO. They will all give you most of the baseline requirements. The next step is to perform a risk assessment and a gap analysis. This is really what we were talking about before as to why every organization is going to have a different program and a different reaction. So you define an acceptable level of risk for your organization, what's acceptable in terms of downtime, how much data loss are you willing to incur should something happen. And here is where you really compare where you are in your organization currently to where you're trying to go. And then research is also a joint effort and communication, a lot of joint effort and communication between subject matter experts, operational personnel, and management within the organization as well. The next step is design. So in the design step, you really want to create, the most important thing here is to create a program that's realistic and cost effective. If you make something so out of your league, people will not want to abide by those requirements if they're too unrealistic. Also, the budget may just not allow for it. So you want to make sure that you increase your security posture, yes, and you strive to make your program better. But you also don't want to make it so unattainable that people feel like they can't even get started. The next part is to identify and prioritize initiatives. So an organization, for example, can identify that a patch management group is needed within their organization. But before you can successfully carry out patch management, you should prioritize asset management, because unfortunately you can't have a successful patch management. It's very difficult to have a successful patch management process if you don't know where all of your assets are. You should also identify essential roles within your organization. So this is identifying the chief roles, so a chief information officer, a chief information security officer, and some other essential roles that you might identify. So for instance, if there is a lot of patch management, you might want a leader of a patch management group. You might want an asset manager for all of the assets in your network. Then there's also an important part in the design, which is to actually take note of your existing resources. So designing a cybersecurity program does not necessarily mean you just throw out all the tools that you currently have. That would be far too expensive for most organizations to do. So what you really should do is try to start with what you already have, see if there's any configurations you can make to existing resources so you can take advantage of the money that's already been spent on those. And then the next and final step of the design is really to create the documentation. So this is usually done by either legal or subject matter experts to actually put it into writing what the policies are for the organization itself. This next phase, or this next step, sorry, in the implementation phase is adoption. So the most important thing here is to actually get leadership support. And this adoption step can actually be done almost parallel to the step before this in design. So the most important thing here is to actually have management and executive support of those policies. The best thing to do here is to involve them actually in the development of those policies. So if you get their feedback and input while you're actually developing those policies, they'll have more of a buy-in in actually implementing and enforcing those. And this is because those management and executives actually have authoritative power. So if they don't believe in the policies, if they don't want to enforce the policies, it's just not, it's going to turn into a piece of paper that nobody really cares to do anything about or enforce it upon the personnel within the organization itself. But besides management support, the other two steps are very important. So this is making the documents available to anybody and everybody in the organization, as long as they don't have sensitive information in them. This is to educate those personnel within the organization as to the new requirements that they have to abide by. So this is changes in passwords. The Post-it note is a good example. It's kind of common knowledge that that is not a best practice to do and that you shouldn't do that. But if you actually have something in writing that says that, you shouldn't keep passwords written. You can actually enforce that, and the policies give you a good way to do that. The next thing in the implementation process and phase is actually implementing. So like I said before, the policy, having it written is just not good enough. What you do in this implementation phase is you actually take those governance documents and turn them into actionable steps. So this is by creating processes and standards, researching new tools, preparing those tools, training personnel on the new requirements under that policy, configuring existing technology. Like I mentioned before, you don't want to throw anything out as long as it is keeping your network secure and you can configure it to improve the security. That's fine. It can usually stay. But the reality of cybersecurity programs is that you probably do need to implement new technology. And then from then on, you should ensure that any new equipment that's brought onto that network actually meets the standards in the policy itself as well. So after that, there's two main components of this monitoring. The first is continuous monitoring of threats and incident identification. So this is properly training personnel, collecting logs, analyzing threats and anomalies, generating reports, and then also keeping note that all of the events that are going to be coming in to those analysts, not every event constitutes an incident that needs to be investigated and followed up on. The second part of monitoring is really evaluating the effectiveness and continuously improving the cybersecurity program itself.
Just real quick for Chip, the monitoring tools, when you say not all incidents are, or not all events are an incident, what does that really mean from your technical perspective?
So when you have a security operations center, one of the key functions that they do is continually tuning the tools to elevate only information that is actionable and that they care about. So taking all of those log messages and determining which of those represent an event, all of those events and which ones that represent an incident. And that's a key function of security operations.
So eliminating false positives?
Eliminating false positives, and more importantly, eliminating false negatives.
Okay. And then also, is part of the monitoring also, because there's new threats all the time, is that part of the monitoring?
That's a huge part of the monitoring, is making sure that your tools are up to date and tuned to capture the newest threats of biggest risks.
So you might adjust your monitoring based on those
It's a
threats that are coming out. Right.
Yeah.
And is there resources that you use to get that information? Like, is that?
So depending on the space you're working within, you may have access to classified indicators of compromise. There's public lists, and there's a ton of resources out there to pull that information from.
Okay, thank you.
So the next important step is to have proper incident response capabilities. So this involves the creation of repeatable processes. So every incident is going to be a little bit different from others, but there should be some baseline steps that are important to note. So, who should an analyst call first? What next steps should they take? And just some of those basic guidelines and recommendations. And it's also important in the incident response steps for organizations to do tabletop exercises periodically. Usually organizations do this about once a year, if not more. And an organization should procure adequate staffing for incident response. So sometimes this is done in-house, sometimes this is contracted out to a third party. Organizations sometimes either staff internally or actually get a third party to perform incident coordination, forensic analysis, and that reverse engineering as well. So regardless of whether you do it in-house or you contract it out to a third party, after every incident, you should have a lessons learned to see if the tool needs to be reconfigured in any way, if there's anything in the process that was unclear to an analyst that needs to be further fleshed out in the documentation. And then another important thing to note here in incident response is cybersecurity insurance. So some organizations actually choose cybersecurity insurance to cover any damages or losses from an incident or a breach. But it's important to keep in mind that before you can get cybersecurity insurance, a lot of providers actually want to see reasonable steps before offering that coverage. So a lot of them will ask to actually see your governance policies. They want to see that you've taken steps to actually document some of the most critical aspects of your cybersecurity program before actually offering that coverage to you.
So like all these steps is, what's like a time period? Like if you had nothing today, what would be a time period to kind of build a program? Your experience with Maryland, you guys they didn't really have an updated one.
Right. So in Maryland, the writing alone of those governance documents took about a year, a little bit more. But the thing with how long it takes is it really also just depends on the organization. So there are central requirements that you can do fairly quickly, and there are configurations and controls you can do without even having policies written. So if your patch management process, let's say, is very out of date and you have critical patches that have not been actually rolled out to systems for, let's say, a couple of months, if not a couple of years, there's no one that's going to say, hey, let's not do that until we actually get something written first. You would say, no, let's actually roll out those critical patches, and then we'll write a process around that.
So you do some things in parallel.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's good.
Yeah. So what does a mature program look like? These are just a couple examples. So in the strategy and compliance, what a mature program will look like is the actual documentation of those governance policies. So these are the 29 policies, for example, within Do It. In the implementation phase, what you have here is a little screenshot of just a flow diagram of this, I believe, is taken from a suspicious email process workflow. So what should you do when a suspicious email comes in? And this is the process documentation that an analyst would use to actually go through that incident. And then at the last part with security operations, that's our security operations center within Skyline, a picture of it. So it's just monitoring an actual incident response at that point and just feeding into the loop again.
That's 24/7
Yes.
monitoring
Mm-hmm.
as well. So just before we move on to the next slide, one question I have is, you went through this process with Maryland's state, but the DOT is part of that, right? It falls underneath that group. What do you think was kind of the greatest challenges you guys saw from putting this in place? Like, what was the challenges you saw? Because obviously a state organization like the DOT or DO-IT are very similar in size.
Right. So I was mostly involved with the development of the governance policies. So the biggest challenge I saw for myself was trying to get upper management and executives involved in the policy development itself and the adoption itself. And it was really important for us to actually get their buy-in as the process went along. Sometimes it was difficult to reach them, but we did our best to try to involve them as much as possible because unfortunately what can happen is you can write those policies and at the end of the day, if you don't have that buy-in, it doesn't turn out to be anything enforceable. And another thing is, and I face this from a couple people, but not everyone, is some of those management and executives are actually the first ones to want an exemption to a policy requirement. So that's also something that it's a very sensitive topic at times, but it's important to reinforce the fact that, hey, if everybody in your organization has to abide by these central principles and requirements, you should abide by that as well.
And those are probably also the people that can allocate funding to some of those changes too. So it's not just hey, do this. They can actually back it up with some moving some funds around or those types of things.
Right, yeah. And if they're not directly in charge of the funding, they're also asking for funding from their management as well.
Right. And then Chip, what about you? What do you think was the biggest challenge technology-wise?
I mean, I think government's a big machine, and getting alignment around all of the tools, because the enterprise effort for Maryland was combining a whole bunch of agencies. So getting everybody aligned around the tool set and the technology was extraordinarily challenging because everybody has their favorite vendor, their favorite firewall, their favorite SIM tool. And I think that was a huge challenge. And the policy helped to drive that because of the requirements that were laid out within that.
Right, and my experience in the DOT world, and I'm sure you guys have seen this too, is that even within a DOT, they could have multiple centers. They could have, toll authority and the DOT. They could have state and local, and if they're interconnected and using different tools, they have the tools they are comfortable with and stuff. So I could see that being same problem on the statewide side as a DOT and the transportation agencies. So
of course, there are organizations out there that already have a cybersecurity program. So what can you do if you already have a cybersecurity program within your organization? So the most important thing here is to audit and check whether your personnel, technology, and processes are actually following the requirements of that program. So are you actually abiding by what it says? This can be done in two ways. There's an automatic way, so you can do vulnerability assessments against your network and systems to see if they're up to par with the configurations that you had originally outlined. Or you can do it in a manual process, which includes surveys, self-assessment questionnaires, meetings with particular divisions throughout the organization to see if they're actually following some of these policies. But the most important thing you can do is if you have an established program within your organization is to create a compliance division so that you're constantly able to audit and check statuses and identify any improvements. So if, for example, you go into some meetings or some self-assessments and you're getting a lot of feedback from people that, hey, our password requirement is just atrociously long. I can't remember a 20-character password with special characters, numbers, and uppercase letters, but you also don't want me to write it down anywhere, so I'm not really sure what I can do. So it's important to get that feedback from your personnel and then make changes accordingly. There's also organizations out there that unfortunately do not have a cybersecurity program. So in their case, they really have to ask themselves, where do I even start? An important thing to ask yourself when you're just starting a cybersecurity program is, are we actually practicing cybersecurity? There's lots of organizations that actually practice cybersecurity and they have a lot of these controls and configurations already in place. What they lack is having it actually written down in one concrete document or 29 documents or whatever, however you choose to structure your program. But a lot of them actually already practice it. So I wouldn't say an organization that doesn't have written policies should, be very scared that they're so far off the mark. They might actually be pretty close. They just need to document that somewhere. The next thing is to look to see if your organization has a cybersecurity program. This might be that your organization just has really old policies. They haven't been updated in a while. Nobody's really following them, so maybe you didn't even know that they existed. So if you find those, that's a great starting point because you can use that as a basis from which to move forward. And then it's very important to get involved in discussions about cybersecurity, really stress to your organization that it's important, that you should worry about it, that you should put in certain controls. And then the last question you should ask yourself, that you're probably asking yourself, is who should I contact? So internally to your organization, who you should contact is you should contact your CIO and your CISO if you have one. There's also, you can see if you have a cybersecurity division. Sometimes it's called an information security division in certain organizations. And then you can also research and reach out to cybersecurity advisors who are more than willing to help you get started on the process of identifying what's important to you and really analyzing where you are and letting you know where you need to be.
So just a quick review. This is one of our last slides here, and then we're going to go into question time. So appreciate everybody hanging in here with us. So we went through the whys, which was really kind of the risks that Chip went through, and what I really took away from that was there's a huge amount of diversity and a lot of exposure points that the DOTs have to think about, and being critical infrastructure, especially in evacuations or incidents or any kind of thing that goes on, weather, those types of things. The transportation network is a huge part of that infrastructure, and so knowing that there's all these moving parts out there and exposure, it's kind of, hey, this is something we need to really be aware of. The what, we talked about that there's resources and frameworks, but that doesn't really give you a, kind of silver bullet solution because it's not a one-size-fits-all. You got to manage your risk and what you're comfortable with and those types of things. And every state DOT is set up a little differently. And then, the how is, it's going to take some energy, right? It's going to take some resources, and it really should be a 24/7 kind of revolving activity. So, it's DOT operations are all about 24/7 operations. They keep the cars moving all the time. They know how important that is. It's and when systems go offline, seriously impacts their ability to deliver. So this is some areas where we're worried about just keeping hardware up some days or connectivity. Add into that cyber threats. There's another factor of things that you have to start to worry about. So I hope you guys kind of enjoyed that, and we're kind of open up to questions at this point.
Thanks, Tom. We do have one question so far, and I certainly encourage you guys to put your questions here in the question pod or the discussion pod here. So the question is, are OT networks considered a SCADA system network? Are OT networks required to be SCADA compliant?
So we're having trouble seeing the whole question here. Oh, there it is. Got it. Yeah. So SCADA system
is that question directed towards Rick, maybe?
Well, I certainly have heard, obviously there's a whole bunch of different types of OT systems within an overall traffic system. I mean, you've got, your traffic cabinets and lights and all. You've got also potentially in an overall Department of Transportation, you've got, HOV gates, toll gates, camera systems, air handlers for tunnels. There's a whole lot of things that can end up being in different states and localities being under that umbrella. And I do hear them often referred to as SCADA systems. I'm not aware of any current requirements, though certainly we may need to head in that direction to have, certain principles and standards on these systems. We're really kind of the early stage of people recognizing the vulnerability there. So I think in general they're often referred to as SCADA systems. I'm not sure if there might be some nuance to that definition that wouldn't apply to all traffic-related OT systems, but that's about the best answer I can give off the top of my head. I'll actually make a note of that, and we'll make sure to address that in the session on the 22nd.
Thanks, Rick. I don't see any more questions.
Another one just popped up.
Oh, actually, one question popped up, and I'm going to read it here. So should DOTs come up, let me see. Should DOTs come up with new ITS devices with built-in security measures, or the current devices can be upgraded to withstand cyber or physical attacks?
So, I mean, I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. I think that I don't think it's really possible to do a forklift replace of an entire DOT network with all new devices. There are a few vendors out there right now that have devices that are capable of providing a higher level of security between those devices that don't have security in mind, like SCADA devices or other kind of unhardened devices. And I think as time goes on, these devices are going to need to have those built-in security measures. I don't think we can continue without that.
Yeah, this is Rick. In our discussions with, people who make cabinets and ATCs and everything, they really they aren't in that field, and they, there's very little discussion that I've found of building in security, though Tom is probably right that if that was Tom, that eventually that will start to happen. But to address the question, absolutely there are things, and we'll be talking about some of these concepts on the 22nd, that can secure what's already there, because that's really the only practical way to approach this at this point. Replacement would take too long. But and one of the key things that we'll talk about too on the 22nd is that too often the approach seems to be the way to make your systems more secure is to limit what it can do. If you wanted to go backwards 15 years in capability, you can make it more secure. That's not a good compromise. What you want to be able to do is take the operations the way you've structured it now, because it's probably what you want to do, and find a way to make it more secure. And so I hope you'll be able to attend part 2.
So this is Chip. I'm seeing Matt's question. So Matt's question is, you mentioned cellular APN has vulnerabilities. can you expand on that and also discuss the high-level overview of best practices when using cellular modems to field equipment? So, the vulnerabilities I think that have been primarily executed against are issues with configuration of APNs. So if the APN isn't configured with security, and that security can include things like only allowing outbound connectivity and preventing internal-to-internal communication, you really need to treat those cellular modems as boundaries. And I think that really is the best practice at that point, is to treat each of those cellular devices as a boundary.
So when you say as a boundary, like, do some of these APNs basically just give you a different IP space that only you have, and then there's no restrictions inside that APN? Is that what you're saying?
So there's a couple different things you can get, and without getting too far into the technical weeds, you can have an APN where you have public IPs, you can have an APN with private IPs, you can have an APN that has internet access or one without. You can have an APN that allows the device-to-device communication or only device-to-hub communication. The Jeep hack in particular was configured to not allow outbound access from the APN, but did allow device-to-device communication, and that's the mechanism that was used for that breach. So, when you have devices, not to get too far off the DOT topic, but when you have devices on there that aren't hardened, like a vehicle's radio is not a hardened network security device. It's something that pulls in radio streams that people listen to. Those devices aren't something that you should consider a hardened device, and they shouldn't have access to the critical command and control of a vehicle. And under no circumstance, the CAN bus, which the radio was segmented from that, but because there was a pivot point in that 850 controller that had both radio access and CAN bus access, they were able to take that and use that as a mechanism of compromise.
Yeah, and this is Rick. We've also, in some of our assessments, we found some very dangerous vulnerabilities through cellular. And so all your points were great regarding trying to secure the cellular connection itself. And then the other thing is, as you talk about, hardened or not hardened devices, if you're also, in addition to doing those things to the cellular traffic itself, if you're also hardening or securing both the network and the endpoints, like the traffic cabinet, that also adds a great deal more security. So even if someone can get into the cellular signal, you can still greatly limit or even prevent what the damage they could otherwise do.
Laura, do you want to maybe take this next question?
Yeah, I'll take Rick's question. So Rick's question is, for a DOT that's just getting started, do you have recommendations of what to focus on initially? So Rick was just talking about this a little bit, but initially I think the main thing that a DOT should focus on are those endpoints, so those potential entries into your network. So hardening up those is probably the first place I'd start. In terms of actual documentation to use or frameworks, I do believe that the proposed framework, so the framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, even though it's in draft version, it is a great document to start from. I believe it's 76 pages or so, so it's not terribly long, but it is long enough to give you a detailed description of what you should be focusing on. And like I mentioned throughout the presentation, it is a baseline requirement, a baseline guideline. So the most important thing would be to actually read through that document, not worry so much about what you're going to do or how you're going to get this whole process started, but really take note of anything in there that's highlighted as a requirement that you don't recall your organization doing at all. And so you use that as a starting point, and I think that provides a very good summary overview of what you should do.
Frank. I don't know if we have. Neither. It looks like we. That was the last question.
Yes, I don't see any more questions right now.
You want to? Oh, here's another one. Is that it? I'll read this one out. A vulnerability concerning the ITS devices is regarding to their location. This makes monitoring process very expensive for DOTs, and at the same time makes them accessible to the adversaries. What could be a good solution for this issue?
So I think that, this is Chip, I think the question that's being asked is when you have these devices that might not have connectivity, how do you monitor them in a way that's cost effective? And I think that, we mentioned cellular modems and cellular APNs. I think that those are probably one of the most cost-effective mechanisms, especially for those mobile devices. One of the states that we work with has recently started to deploy that sort of connectivity in all of their mobile signs. And I think they might be pretty close to done putting in all of their mobile signs because of that exact risk that you're talking about. Without being able to monitor and having it done in a cost-effective way, there's pretty significant risk.
Yeah, one other thing, that's a great point, Chip, and this is Rick, one other thing I would add is that if you're talking about the physical security after those devices and everything, and the fact that somebody could get into a cabinet and take it over that way, either remotely or physically, one of the things you want to do is have your network protected in a way that both the cabinets, just to speak of them specifically, the cabinets are protected from above, from malware that might come from above, right, tampering top down from IT to OT. But also, if someone does take control of a single cabinet, that's bad, and you obviously you want to try and do everything you can to prevent that. But the much greater danger is someone getting into a cabinet and swimming up into your network and then having access from there into your entire city or statewide network. And again, one of the things you'll want to build into your prevention strategy is a communication channel that basically prevents if a cabinet is taken over in the process of someone doing that, they would basically invalidate their ability to go upstream. And it's something we'll talk about a little bit again on the 22nd. And that way you've limited the damage to that one cabinet and protected the rest of your network.
I think that's all the questions. Do we want to go into Rick's slides, the preview of the next session?
Sure, yeah, sounds good.
Okay, well, everyone, this will only take a minute or two. We're just going to give a very brief preview. We've already touched on this a little bit. Great session today, really interesting stuff, and I hope those of you who got a lot out of it will want to come back on the 22nd. The things we're going to be stressing there are really getting into more the nuts and bolts of, first of all, understanding the difference between the IT and the OT environments and how they really need to be addressed holistically, but it's different tools. You can't really take traditional IT tools and use them to comprehensively protect the OT side of your network. You really need things that are built and both software and hardware that are designed for that. So as much as you want to be doing everything you should be doing, not dissuading any way of doing the IT protections up here we'll talk a little bit about the Purdue levels, start at level 4, which is your traditional IT network, working down through the levels down to level 0, which is your equipment in the field. And the solutions that will do a good job of addressing your IT network aren't necessarily going to provide that coverage out into the OT network. And what you really want to make sure you're able to provide here is a full cycle of protection, so that you're monitoring your network, both at its core level but out at the extremities where you're most vulnerable, and then detecting any attempted intrusions, malicious code, things like that, informing an operator, so that they can take action. In some cases, having automated actions, automated blockages, or reset to a desired state, which moves us into this sort of corrective action. So ideally, you want to have all these steps where either you can manually or remotely manually or automatically, have your equipment either revert to its prior good state, or at least fall into a known safe state if an attempted attack occurs. As a worst case scenario, you might go into a flash mode or something like that, not allow the takeover. And then also collect the data on that. And that's one step that a lot of protections tend to miss, because you want to understand, what did happen, what was someone trying to do to you, so that you can build in, future protection. So that's just a very quick snapshot of some of the things we're going to cover. And we're going to talk about some of the things that were asked in the Q&A here today. So it was great about things like, do you have to really do all new equipment, or can you protect what's there? And one of the most important things is really, these networks are vulnerable today, but it's the future and the future is basically already here. We all know about all the pilots and connected and autonomous vehicle work being done, and really we can't trust those vehicles, even as well protected as they may be, and there are questions about that, but let's assume they're completely protected. The vehicles are in perfect protection. Attaching them to this older infrastructure that isn't protected makes everything vulnerable. So that's what we'll be looking forward on the 22nd, and I hope that all of you will join us and invite others.
Thanks, Rick. I think like you said, I invite everyone to join us for part 2 of this webinar, and here on the screen I have the link to the registration page. So again, I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and also thank our panels here. We had some very good information shared with us today. A recorded version of this webinar along with the presentation slides will be available on our website. On behalf of National Operations Center of Excellence and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.